That's a great picture. Greetings. Welcome to the second installment of Performance, Not Politics with State Senate candidate John Keenan. My name is Victor Gravio. I'm here tonight with Quincy City Councilor John Keenan, candidate for State Senator. John?
Good evening, Vic.
How are you?
Good. How about yourself?
Good, thanks. How's the campaign going?
It's going well. The summer continues to be quite hot. I thought July was going to be the end of the hot and humid weather, but we had a 3-day break and it's back to hot and humid. But that's okay. You know, as I said to somebody tonight, as long as I keep moving, the heat doesn't bother me, so it's going well.
Great.
We've been out and about, still doing standouts in the morning and evenings and hitting the doors every single night in all the different towns. We had a great day down in Rockland the other day. We were down there about 4.5, 5 hours meeting people at the doors, and reception was great. Same thing in Quincy and Braintree, and same thing with Abington, so things are going very well. That's
great. When I talk to people, I hear you're all over the district. It's people are responding well, folks I'm talking to, so that's fantastic.
Yeah, it kind of goes in circles. You get out there, and I've been doing this for several months now, and you just keep going, and then all of a sudden you're in one neighborhood, maybe 2 miles away from where you were a month and a half ago, and you run across somebody at a cookout that says, hey, you were by my door a month and a half ago, and so it goes in circles, and you start seeing people who know people, and it's amazing what a small world it is out there.
Really?
Yeah.
That's great. Well, one of the issues that I'm hearing about, and people seem to be talking about, is the casino issue and the vote on Beacon Hill to try to expand legalized gambling in Massachusetts. What are you hearing from folks, and what's your position on the legislation?
I guess I'll start first with my position on the legislation. I support the casinos. I support destination casinos. I do not support the slots at the local tracks. I think it's problematic at several levels. One, I do think it's a problem with bidding. I'm not so sure the state will realize the type of money they should realize. When you're talking with a small number of bidders, looking for just a couple licenses, so to speak, right. The potential for, I guess, not getting enough money or as much as you would hope to get it is there. Also, I do think that the slots are really kind of the hardcore gambling that would feed into people who may have gambling problems. You know, a lot of people go to the casinos, and it's a destination. It's a day out. It's a bus trip. It's an opportunity to get a lunch, a buffet lunch, spend a couple hours in the casino, maybe do some shopping. So I think those are more of an entertainment type venue, more of a destination type venue, and so I support them. I'm not a big, honestly, supporter of gambling overall, but my more pragmatic side says if we are allowing all this money to go down to Connecticut, we might as well capture some of it here. And it's kind of interesting. People don't want to pay taxes, but they're willing to pay and play in the casinos, knowing that they're probably going to lose, but there's also that potential to win. And they know that the money comes back through local aid to the communities. And so there is a bit of knowledge about that, and it seems to be somewhat of an accepted way. So I think if it's done carefully, it will work. It's not the be-all, end-all for the economy. It's not a wealth generator. It's not a job creator in the grand sense. There will be jobs associated with the casinos in construction and in the day-to-day operation, but it's more of a transfer of wealth, really. So there is a role for it, but it's not going to solve our economic problems. It's a piece of the puzzle, but I think we should continue with it and make sure that it's done properly. One of the things that I would make sure is done on the legislation is to ensure that there's not a revolving door between the regulatory agencies and the casinos themselves. You can't have people who are serving on the regulatory agency then having the ability, even after 2 years or 3 years, to jump over to a casino. It's just an opportunity for corruption and problems of that nature. So I'd make sure that the regulatory framework is very tight, very well controlled. And I think the other problem that people are expressing, well, I don't think, it is what's been expressed to me, is people are very frustrated at the process that was involved in the casino gambling legislation. I heard it at doors. Why did it end up this way? Everybody's been talking about it for a couple of years. They've had it before the legislature. All of a sudden, it's the last minute. They know the governor's probably going to veto it. It comes down to the last minute. They pass it. They know the governor's going to veto it. The governor, in fact, says, I'm not going to sign it. And people are scratching their heads saying, how did it get to this point? Why wasn't it resolved earlier? That's a big part of the frustration.
Mm-hmm. How do you prevent something like that from happening? How did the seeming rush to get that and so many other issues resolved at the last minute? Is that something that, how does that change?
Well, I think you have to look at the rules. There's a rule presently that affects joint committees in the legislature that anything that's filed has to be reported out by committee by, I think it's the third Wednesday in March. And you have to keep in mind that that's 15 months into the legislative session, a session that will end in July. So it's almost set up for procrastination in some way.
Because it's a 2-year legislative session.
2-year legislative session. You start in January. Bills can be filed throughout, and they don't have to be reported out of committee until basically 15 months after the session starts. And it's right at that time as well that the legislature gets consumed by the budget. So you have this deadline of trying to get bills out. You have the budget that takes precedent, and things get lost. So one of the ideas might be to move change the rule so that things have to be reported out earlier. Perhaps you have a November or early December reporting out of bills. You maybe look at the idea that bills can't be carried over. Presently now, if a bill is filed in March of the first year of the session, it can be carried over into the following year's session. That would be a little bit different from what they've done recently. It would go back to what they did a few years ago. I'm not so sure it will work. I'm not convinced of it, but it's absolutely something that should be looked at because you just can't put things off to the last minute. It results in last minute legislation. Literally, legislation in this session was changed overnight. I think it was a Friday night, and legislators came back on a Saturday, and they had a new bill before them. They don't get a chance to read it. They have to rely on leadership. And also, it increases the opportunity for the lobbyist and special interests to exert maybe disproportionate influence over legislation because it just hasn't gone through a thorough process at that stage. So I think changing the rules is one way to look at it. The other way would be to give some more latitude to committee chairs, that they have more latitude to move things through their committee, and maybe even set it up so that if a committee chair is not acting in a timely fashion, that members of the committee are more free to move legislation out and put it before the floor. And the City Council, which is not perfect by any means, we have some late night sessions, but at the City Council, when there's regulation or a zoning amendment or something like that filed that goes into committee or financial order, it goes into committee. The committee chairperson schedules a hearing on it, schedules a meeting, and then just moves it through quickly. And the council president allows that to happen, doesn't exert all kinds of control over the legislation. And it also, if a committee chair says, I'm not going to do anything on this, the council president's asked me not to, whatever, the majority of the committee can move to have it taken out of committee and put before the full council. So I think the combination of rules change and also giving committee chairs a little more latitude and members perhaps more of an ability to move legislation might solve the problem that we had. People were just very frustrated with it. It was pretty widely commented upon. So.
Yeah, no, we heard a lot about that. You had mentioned the state budget. Do you have any thoughts on the budget that was passed, went into effect on July 1st of this year?
That's a lot of money. But actually not as much money as the year before. It's about $31.1 million, which is down about $218 million.
Sorry,
billion.
Right.
That's
okay.
right. Yeah,
Thanks.
Billion. Thank you. Billion, before you know it, you're
Right,
talking serious
it's
money.
real money, exactly.
So you're talking about $31.1 billion, which is down about $218 million over last year. And that's a pretty, I get about as level funded budget you're probably going to get when you're talking about those numbers. The big thing that is appears to be a problem in this year's budget is that there's some structural deficits. There's about $270 million within the budget that is one-time revenue. And for instance, there's money coming out of the stabilization fund. That's one-time revenue being used to pay for recurring costs. There's interest on the earnings in the stabilization fund that's being withdrawn. So the stabilization fund doesn't have the ability to keep generating interest. There's various accounts in state government that sometimes go untapped, that may be sitting there and have excesses that have accumulated over the years in some of the trust funds. And that money is being drawn out. So the stabilization fund is diminishing. You're using the interest on the stabilization fund. You're drawing the money out of the trust funds that's there as excess, which you can do and put it to use, but you shouldn't be using it for recurring expenses. It's almost like you walk down the street and you find $500 in the street, and you go into the car dealership and say, I'll take a lease on that car for $500 a month. Well, you have $500 to pay your first lease payment. What do you do the next time? So it's a similar type theory, and it doesn't work. It doesn't work on a lease for a car, and it doesn't work for state government. So that's the big concern in the budget, as far as I'm concerned, this year.
I just been hearing a lot recently that the Congress has made more money available to states, as much as $687 million, I think, for Massachusetts. What are your thoughts on how the money should be handled once we receive it?
Well, it's interesting. You know, there were plans for that money, and then there was a sense that the money was not going to be available. So the budget that was ultimately passed and signed by the governor did not include the FEMAP money, which is the Medicare, Medicaid money. So the budget now does not rely on that. But some of the cuts that were made in the budget, because that money wasn't available, were pretty severe cuts, and they were pretty widespread. But the first reaction, once word got out that this money may be available, was let's get in session and let's spend the money. There wasn't a lot of thought to taking a step back and saying there's a whole host of programs that have been affected by this, departments, agencies, programs. There's a whole long list of things that were affected by this. Why don't we take a step back and see how we're doing in the budget that was passed on July 1st before we make any decisions about where we're going to spend money. There are some glaring areas of need, some areas that suffered some pretty significant budget cuts. Human services is one of the areas. That's an area you would look at and say, maybe we have to do something there more quickly than in other areas. There may be other agencies where, you know what, they're doing okay without this money. Rather than just throw the money back, let's just take a step back, wait and see how it goes, maybe act on it if we have to, you know, the legislature has to, later in the year or at the beginning of the next legislative session, which would still be within the same fiscal year. So the rush to spend it is somewhat concerning, and I think in the grander scheme that's a concern.